10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thanks for being here. If you're new to the podcast, thank you for checking it out today, and I hope after the episode you will think about subscribing or following, whatever your app says, if you enjoy the podcast. When you subscribe, you'll automatically get new episodes. You don't have to go searching a couple of times a week to find them. And also, while we're talking about inviting you to do things, let me invite you to connect with 10-Minute Murder on Facebook and Instagram. There will be links in the show notes of this episode, or just as easily, you can type it into the search bar of Facebook and Instagram. And that's where I post visuals to go along with the stories that you're hearing about. It's nothing gross and graphic, but it's enough for you to put a face to the names that you're hearing about. And today's story, I'm not sure how much of a visual I can post because it happened a long time ago. The story today, it's not a new one, and it's going to be a little bit longer than 10 minutes, so plan accordingly. It may be the first recorded case of a family working in collaboration as serial killers. You're going to hear about the Bender family and how they ran a little bed and breakfast, which was basically just a one-room cabin with a burlap curtain dividing it to make it into another room. When they built it, they made it to what it became, a kill house, complete with a trap door to the cellar. This is the story of the Bloody Benders. Being a traveler back in the 1800s must have been something awful. There's no online booking, and you can't even call ahead to make sure there's a room reserved for a place to stay. There's no Yelp review to make sure you're not about to sleep on a bedbug bed that was rented by the hour just earlier that day. You're trusting that people are doing the right thing. And I know without a doubt, I would not have been thriving if I lived during that time. I like to wash my hands too much, and I enjoy a mid-afternoon iced coffee. Despite the fact that I couldn't personally do it, some people did, and some of those people being the Bender family in Kansas. To start, let me introduce you to the members of the family. First, there's John Bender Sr. During the time we're going to talk about, he was around 60 years old, which is practically ancient in the 1800s. He spoke very little English, instead relying on grunts and other noises to communicate. He was also known to go by the name of William, but we'll only refer to him as John Sr. in this story to make it less confusing. Then, 55-year-old Elvira Bender. She was married to John and also spoke very little English. Elvira was also not very friendly. Neighbors that encountered her nicknamed her She-Devil. By the way, the reason they didn't speak English well or at all is because they were German immigrants. John Bender Jr. was around 25 years old and spoke with a German accent, but he was fluent in English. He had deep red hair, a mustache, and was considered handsome by many. He laughed all the time, sometimes at nothing at all, which led to people calling him a half-wit. Finally, the pride and joy of the Benders, Kate. She was around 23, attractive, cultured, slight German accent, and a self-proclaimed healer and psychic. She made up flyers that advertised her supernatural powers and ability to cure illnesses. Kate was known to communicate with the dead through seance and gave lectures on spiritualism. It's not known for sure if Kate and John were brother and sister or common-law husband and wife, or both, but they were two members of the family that were the most seen out and about, attending church together at nearby Harmony Grove. People around the area gossiped about the Benders and speculated. The rumor that was based quite a bit in fact is that Elvira had been married before, a bunch of times before actually, and claimed to have 12 kids with one of those men, Kate being the fifth. She was suspected of murdering her previous husbands, but they could never prove that it happened. Neighbors also speculated about the relationship of John Jr. and Kate. And obviously they didn't have someone like my mom living there because she would have just straight up asked, "So is that your brother or what?" Record keeping around that time wasn't fantastic, but what people wrote about the Benders was the old man was a repulsive, hideous brute without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. I'm going to start calling people that. Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face, a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. Young Bender, seen when excited, recalled the grave-robbing hyena at once to mind. Kate proclaimed herself responsible to no one save herself. She professed to be a medium of spiritualism and delivered lectures on that subject. In her lectures, she publicly declared that murder might be a dictation for good, that in what the world might deem villainy, her soul might read bravery, nobility, and humanity. She advocated free love and denounced all social regulations for the promotion of purity and the prevention of carnality, which she called miserable requirements of self-constituted society. She maintained carnal relations with her brother and boldly proclaimed her right to do so. And the following words found in her lecture manuscript: "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their prosperous sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." So, in October of 1870, 5 different families of spiritualists homesteaded in and around the township of Osage in northwestern Labette County. The Benders had 160 acres of land that joined with the Great Osage Trail, which is a very common route for travelers heading west. They built a cabin, a barn, and dug a well. They took the wagon cover from their wagon and put it inside and used it as a room divider. The smaller area in the back for living quarters and the front space was made into a general store. There was a kitchen, a table with chairs, and travelers could stop in, have a meal, even spend the night. Obviously, during this time, law and order was mostly in the hands of the people living there. They policed themselves. The area became known for horse thieves and villains. When people started coming up missing, communities of residents arrested people, who, by the way, were completely innocent. They later had to let them go once the actual authorities stepped in, but that didn't stop people from disappearing. In May 1871, the body of a man named Jones was discovered in Drum Creek. He had his throat cut and his skull crushed. And you'll learn in a few minutes that those injuries were common among victims because of the process of killing that the Bender family used. The next year, 2 more bodies were discovered with the exact same type of fatal injuries as Jones. By 1873, reports of people going missing in that area were so common that travelers started finding an alternate route, even though it added time to their journey. In the winter of 1872, a man named George Longcore and his daughter Mary Ann were headed to resettle in Iowa. They never made it. A former neighbor of that man and friend, Dr. William York, went looking for him and his daughter. He questioned everyone he encountered along the trail. He made it all the way there and headed back home, but he never made it back home. So Dr. York also disappeared. But Dr. York had 2 brothers that knew about his travel plans, and when he didn't check in, they went out looking. One of those brothers was Colonel Alexander York, a Civil War vet, a lawyer, and a Kansas senator. Together, they rounded up 50 men to help in the search. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender's Inn, and they admitted that their brother, Dr. York, had stayed with them, and suggested that if he wasn't where he was supposed to be, then maybe the Indians got him, which Colonel York agreed was possible. A few days later, Colonel York heard about a lady being threatened at knife point at the Bender's Inn by Elvira, so he took several armed men to investigate. Elvira told them that she couldn't understand English, but the younger Benders denied the whole story. Colonel York then insisted that it did happen, and Elvira started shouting that the lady was a witch and had cursed her coffee. So that's why she pulled the knife on her. And obviously, they realized she was lying about not being able to speak any English before. She could speak some English, not a whole bunch, but enough to communicate. Before York left, Kate, pretty and well-spoken Kate, told Colonel York to come back to the inn later that night, alone, where she'd use her clairvoyant abilities to help find his brother. Again, this is another insight into how the Benders would operate their kill house that you'll learn about in a few minutes. Colonel York obviously didn't fall for that. So they all wanted to get to the bottom of the disappearances. Neighboring communities were also concerned, so they all got together and held a meeting at Harmony Grove Schoolhouse. The 75 people in attendance agreed that search warrants would be issued, searching everyone's home for evidence. And leading up to that big meeting, nobody kept an eye on the Benders. It was days later before they realized the Benders bounced. They snuck away without saying a word to anyone. Their animals were still there, not being fed, but all of their food and personal things were gone. They also noticed a foul smell that led them to the trap door in the floor of the cabin. It was located under a bed. It was nailed shut, and when they pried it open, they saw lots of blood, but no people, no bodies. The cabin was small enough that a bunch of men surrounded the outside of the cabin and were able to physically lift it up and move it so that they could dig underneath and search for bodies. They still didn't find any. They spread out around the cabin and started searching the ground where it had been disturbed. And bingo, the first body they found was Dr. York. He was buried face down and just barely below the surface. They found 9 other bodies and many body parts around the property, with one of them thrown into the well. All of them, except one little girl that had possibly been strangled or buried alive, had the exact same injuries, a slashed throat and a bashed head. After conducting interviews, examining the cabin and the rest of the evidence, the process of the bloody Benders was speculated. When a guest would stay with the Benders, they were given a seat at the head of the table. The seat was placed near the trap door and the back to the partition that divided the room. Kate would distract the guests using her looks and charm, while either John Jr. or John Sr. came from behind them, from behind that curtain, and hit them over the head with a hammer, always to the right side of the head. To make sure they were dead, their throat was cut, most likely by one of the women. The body was then dropped through the trap door. In the cellar, they were stripped and had all of their possessions taken. Some people killed were wealthy, but others were obviously not wealthy, which was speculated that they killed their guests just because they wanted to. It wasn't all money motivated. Testimony from people who had stayed in the Benders Inn and had managed to escape before they could be killed supported the theory of how it was done. One man said that he refused to sit near the wagon cloth because of the stains that were on it. He didn't want to be near it, and he was threatened with a knife by Kate Bender, so he left. A Catholic priest claimed that he had seen one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer, at which point he became uncomfortable and quickly left. 2 men that had traveled there just to experience Kate Bender's psychic powers, they stayed on for dinner but refused to sit at the table next to the cloth, instead preferring to eat their meal at the main shop counter. Kate then became abusive toward them, and a short while later the 2 Bender men emerged from behind the cloth. At this point, the customers began to feel uneasy and decided to leave, a move that almost certainly saved their lives. More than a dozen bullet holes were found in the roof and the sides of the cabin. The media speculated that some of the victims had attempted to fight back after being hit with the hammer. Detectives tracked the escape of the Benders and found that they had split up. The younger Benders headed south and were close to the Texas-New Mexico border when John Jr. had a stroke and died. They weren't pursued there because it was a common area known for lawmen to never return from, an area full of outlaws. John Sr. and Elvira headed north and then eventually to St. Louis, Missouri. Because of the rewards for their capture, so many different people claimed to have caught them and killed them, but none of their stories ever confirmed. The reward had reached $3,000, which in today's money is almost $65,000. Back at the Bender Inn, 12 men were arrested after it was found that they had been involved in helping by disposing of the victims' stolen possessions. To this day, it's still unknown what exactly happened to the Bender family. And that's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Thanks for listening today. If you have a story you'd like for me to possibly cover, you can email it to me, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. I'll read it over and check it out. You can easily connect with this podcast on social media. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode, or even easier, type 10-Minute Murder into Facebook or Instagram. Before you go, subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening right now, and you'll never miss an episode. If you have friends that are into brief true crime stories like this one, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.